Beyond Duality, Defining and Measuring Poverty. In this presentation, Harris and I will present our own unique definition and system of measurement regarding the issue of poverty in society. To do this, we will break our presentation into two parts. How do we define poverty and how do we measure poverty? We hope that this presentation acts as a catalyst for further discourse regarding poverty in America and human society as a whole. Let's begin. To a majority of people, poverty is resource deprivation or income deprivation. However, poverty is not so easily definable. It's not just extremes, such as destitution or comfort. There are multiple nuances in impoverishment, and furthermore, there are differing degrees to which economic hardship affects one's life. For example, intersectionality, defined by Merriam-Webster as the complex cumulative manner in which the effects of different forms of discrimination combine, overlap, or intersect. There are a few questions that we ask when defining poverty. If poverty is a lack of essential resources, which resources qualify as essential? If poverty is an issue of income deprivation, what is the minimum income someone needs to live without poverty? If poverty is the result of one's environment, how do we define which environments are conducive to poverty? And if poverty is an issue of persistence from father to son, how do we pinpoint its cause? Scholars well acquainted with the subject have put out definitions of poverty. Some include John Iceland's definition, which defines poverty as referring to economic or income deprivation, or Amartya Sen's, which says that poverty is not a matter of low well-being, but of the inability to pursue well-being because of the lack of economic means. Or lastly, Robert Rector's implicit definition, that poverty is defined as a material deprivation or the lack of funds to fulfill sufficient needs. In creating a definition, we must create a definition that accounts for all aspects of poverty, addresses all questions, and provides enough generalization so that no one is excluded. It's a tall order, but with careful consideration, we have defined poverty as this. Poverty, a state of being in which a person lacks full agency to obtain those certain resources or realize those certain circumstances that qualify a dignified existence. We're now going to break this definition down. First, a state of being. A state of being is not a complete life, but a present reality. It's the here and now, not an absolute characterization of life in its entirety. Poverty is a fluctuating condition. Certain factors can put people above or below the poverty line or other places on the poverty scale, depending on the financial season that they're in. A person. In this definition, we have decided to define a person as any human being, regardless of background, education, mental health, mental faculty, or physical ability. Lacks full agency. Agency is not black and white. It is possible to achieve some measure of a thing without achieving it in its entirety. Disclaimer: full does not refer to the best care or resources money can buy. That does not mean the best car or the best service. Rather, it means uninhibited freedom to pursue. If a person lacks full agency, they do not have this freedom. Agency. Part of agency is functionings, parts of the state of a person, in particular the various things that he or she manages to do or be in leading a life. These are the doings and beings of a person. Secondly, there are capabilities, which reflect the alternative combinations of functionings a person can achieve. Capabilities are contingent on the existence of functionings. Simply, capabilities reflect a person's ability to achieve functionings. In this definition, we have taken a capabilities approach to poverty. This focuses on the ability of an individual to achieve or obtain the components of well-being rather than the components themselves. Imagine that in order to live well, one must own 4 rubber ducks. To have 4 is to live comfortably. To have any less means you are impoverished. A capabilities approach focuses on not the functionings, aka the rubber ducks themselves, but on a person's ability to obtain them. Does a person have transportation to the rubber duck store to get them? Do they have a job that gives them income to purchase the ducks? Do they have the education needed to hold a job to make the income to afford the rubber ducks? In short, agency refers to an individual's capability. Obtain and realize. Both of these refer to achievement of functionings. Achievement is the subject of capabilities. It is not enough to consider a person's achievements of functionings when considering poverty. The person's ability to achieve must be considered above all. Those certain resources or those certain circumstances. Those certain to us regards widely acknowledged resources and circumstances as being central to well-being. These are relative to the greater non-impoverished population. Resources include the basic necessities of life, often referred to as FCSU needs, that is food, clothing, shelter, utilities, and sometimes healthcare and education. Circumstances refer to, according to Martha Nussbaum, there are 10 capabilities that are central to human dignity. These are life, bodily health, bodily integrity, senses, imagination and thought, emotions, practical reason, affiliation, other species, play, and control over one's environment. Qualify. To qualify a dignified life, one must possess FCSU needs and the 10 central capabilities, at minimum, which define a person's poverty status. These include utilities, food, shelter, control over one's environment, practical thought, and life. These are the most commonly recognized bases for the qualification of a dignified existence. We will revisit them in the measurement. A dignified existence. Dignity is based on a freedom of choice. This includes allowing those with the capabilities to achieve certain functionings. But who choose not to use them to continue to do so. An example of this are monks. There's an emphasis on treating human beings as human beings. A dignified existence is defined primarily by the individual experiencing it, or the lack of it, and defined secondarily by society, which is relative. Dignified existence, there's a danger in treating impoverished people as saints as well as sinners. We must respect their freedom of choice. Conclusions. In our definition of poverty, there is a focus on agency, that is capabilities, not actual ownership or realization of functionings. And dignity, freedom of choice, which is ever-changing and relative to the greater non-impoverished population. Next, let's move to measurement.
Now we're going to look at how we measure poverty. First, we need to start out with some definitions, which are types of measurement. There are absolute measures, which are mainly focused on how much you have, the absolute amount of what you have. There are relative measures, which is how much you have in comparison to another measure or another person. There are quantitative measures, which are rooted in numbers, and discursive measures, which are rooted in abstract conversation. If two people can agree that someone's in a certain state, then that's a discursive measure, if there's no numbers involved. The United States uses an official poverty measure. The OPM looks at household income before taxes. That's gross annual income before taxes. They set the poverty threshold at 3 times a food basket that the census believes will adequately feed a family. It's set at 3 times because in the 60s, when this measure was created, they saw that a third of the spending was spent on food. So using a little algebra, that's how they got their value, or their threshold. And the threshold is also adjusted for inflation and family composition. The pros of the OPM are that both the threshold and the household status are relatively easy to compute. Very basic tax information is taken, and they can get the data they need to set the threshold and see if a household is impoverished or not. It also establishes a simple duality where you're either impoverished or you are not impoverished. There's no gray area. The shortcomings are that it's outdated. It was developed in the 60s, so it misses out on a lot of aspects of our new economy. It doesn't factor in-kind benefits like SNAP, which is what you would think is food stamps, and other programs. Near cash benefits like the earned income tax credit, and non-discretionary spending like daycare and transportation to work. It doesn't account for non-traditional households either, so cohabiting couples are not really defined by the OPM. It has a rather simplistic way of determining the threshold, which is just 3 times a food basket. It doesn't address differences in cost living in different areas, so living in New York versus North Dakota definitely has different expenses, but it's the same under the OPM. An alternative to the OPM is the SPM, which is the Supplementary Poverty Measure. It looks at SU spending instead of income. It accounts for most of the benefits that the OPM leaves out, and the poverty line is relative to society. it's 33% of the median income times 1.2. The 1.2 being a factor to account for spending outside of FCSU. So they believe that humans need recreation or other forms of, or other outlets to be humans. Um, Pros of the SPM are that it accounts for geographical differences. It treats households as individuals living under a roof. So instead of, if grandma's living with you and your boyfriend for 3 years, it's going to be counted for in this, which it wouldn't be in the OPM. It looks at the expenses of families holistically with the FCSU spending and discretionary spending. The cons of the SPM are that it's very complicated and hopeful. It's a binary system, so you're either impoverished or you're not. And there are reporting issues. You can definitely abuse the numbers to make yourself look impoverished if needed. It's seemingly too expensive with all the data you need to collect. And it doesn't factor in the quality of life, the central capabilities we talked about earlier. What we believe a poverty measure should capture is material needs, which is FCSU, and health and education, which is basically the SPM, and essential capabilities, which is not covered in the SPM. We want to make sure that the quality of a life and the dignity of a life is measured in our measure. The difficulties in factoring in the capabilities is that it's hard to quantify one in relation to another. How valuable is a year of life expectancy versus if you have had a bunch of dogs? I think it's hard to relate the two. And it also comes with the assumption that having a lot of one and a little of another is the same as having adequate levels of both, which we know is wrong. Our proposal is to make an amended SPM, which is based off the SPM in that it looks at food, shelter, clothing, utilities, and health, and education. And that's because material resources are important. We're also going to include a geographic capabilities factor, which is pretty much a broad multiplier that would account for capabilities of a given area. Because you can't really look at the individual case, but you can look at data from communities to get a little bit of insight into how people are actually functioning. This would look like a model, pretty much. It would take variables in the real world and try to liken them to a capability, in that we can then quantify somewhat the amount of a capability that a certain community has. So for life, we would use life expectancy. For bodily health, we could use average ER wait time. We could use number of hospitals. You could use percentage of people insured. The list goes on, but by finding a measure that accurately relates, or that we believe accurately relates, bodily health in a capability sense is what would help out this model. For bodily integrity, we'd look at crime rates or just general relative level of danger in a given area. And for sense, imagination, thought, emotions, practical reasoning, and affiliation, we thought that there could be some form of educational quality or developmental quality that would cover this. We also want to stress the importance of distribution. A hard poverty line doesn't really tell much about how the community is doing or how the society is doing. Instead, we want to set multiple thresholds as well as release the descriptive statistics of the distribution so that people actually understand how the society is operating. Instead of just having people who are poor or not poor, you're going to have levels of severe poverty, moderate poverty, very moderate poverty, so you can actually see where people are falling in this line and how people are actually living. We also want to release measures relating how people move throughout the entire distribution to see if people are moving from out of severe poverty to just moderate poverty, which is, again, a very important thing to look at in a society. The downsides of our measure is that it's very hopeful. I mean, there's a lot of tweaking that may be needed, and it may oversimplify a lot of the problems that are very apparent, but at least we're actively trying to right these problems. It'll require a lot of manipulation to get accurate results, in that you will need to tweak the factors so that life expectancy versus education is represented in an accurate way. And it also lacks the discursive aspect, which would be really helpful, but for the sake of measuring and showing a distribution, we believe that quantitative numbers, quantitative measures are what we really need. And it will require a lot of time and data collection, which will require money, but that's not what we're worried about. We're worried about getting an accurate measure. Why we think our measure is better is because it treats people as more than numbers. Although it does boil down to numbers in the end, it actually takes into account their quality of life and the dignity that they need. It also takes into account the capabilities approach, which is something that most measures don't do right now, especially the OPM, which is a very simplistic measure. It shows the actual activity of the economy as well as quality of life through the distribution and the measures of where people are moving over time. And though it's not perfect, it has the potential to be a lot better than the current measures. And that's really what we're focused on, is if a current measure has an inherent flaw, something needs to be changed about it. And that's what we're trying to do. Hope you enjoyed our presentation and learned about poverty and how we should look at it.